Hi and welcome back to video 2 in this 3-part mini video series of how to podcast. In the last video I explained to you a bit about where we currently are with podcasting and how it's growing in popularity and how you can use it as a marketing tool. In this video I'm going to explain to you what the biggest mistakes people make when starting a podcast, the who, what and why that you should consider before you start creating your podcast, and how you're going to define a successful podcast. One of the biggest mistakes that people make when starting a podcast is not having a system. If you don't have a system, then you're setting yourself up to fail. This applies to all walks of life, from starting a business to doing DIY. Knowing the technical steps will simply not be enough. There's more to podcasting than just making a recording. You also need to know where to upload it to, how to launch your podcast and other aspects too, and it's like anything, you need to prepare and have a plan. I never used to abide by this rule. I used to just jump into things, and so consequently I've experienced many disasters with things like decorating and gardening. Without any preparation or a plan, things got done in the wrong order and so never got finished on time, or in some cases not at all. So remember the 5 Ps. This is always a very good rule to abide by. The 5 Ps are proper prior planning prevents poor performance. And so you should apply this rule to your podcast before writing the script or recording your episode. So let's start with the who, what and why. Ask yourself this question. Who will be your ideal listener? What age will they be? What gender will they be? What income range will they have? What will their marital status be? What employment status do they have? What is their business association? What interests do they have? By asking yourself these questions, you build up a picture of your ideal listener. That way you will find it easier to speak out to them. You could also ask who has a problem that your podcast can solve, or who will benefit from the information in the podcast. Next is what. If you already have the luxury of a list of subscribers on an email list, you could do a survey and ask them questions such as, what are your biggest challenges? What would your audience like to know more about? What would your audience not be interested to learn more about? What's one main benefit that your audience would need to get to tune into a podcast? And what's your favourite book, blog or podcast about? Of course, not all of us have the luxury of having a list, so you could ask colleagues, friends and family, or even do research online. The why question then. Why is your podcast going to be different? Why will listeners tune into your podcast versus others in your niche? Why should listeners subscribe and continue to listen to episodes on an ongoing basis? To answer this question, you could write down these prompts. Does your podcast convey a benefit, offer a clear point of view, or stand out when you picture it next to other podcasts in your category? The whole idea of asking these questions is so that you have an idea of what content you will need to create, because once you start, you don't want to have to change direction, especially if you start to get some momentum with your audience. Once you've defined the who, what and why, it's then important to define what success will look like to you. What do you want your podcast to achieve? Do you want to connect with new prospects and clients? Do you want to become an influencer or a decision maker? Do you want to sell sponsorship for your podcast? Do you want to sell programs or services from your podcast? Or do you want your listeners to opt into your email list? So take a moment to write down what successes would look like to you, including your priorities and goals. So in this video, we've looked at planning and what you need to think about before you start recording your own podcast. In the next video, we'll look at what format you should use and what equipment you will need.